In the grand pantheon of corporate hubris, few tales are as deliciously ironic as that of Sega Enterprises. Here was a company that spent decades perfecting the art of snatching defeat from the jaws of victory, displaying a talent for self-sabotage so consistent, so artfully executed, that one might mistake it for strategy. Our story begins in 1940 Hawaii, where three gentlemen, Martin Bromley, Irving Bromberg, and James Humpert, founded Service Games in Honolulu, a company that would eventually become Sega. Initially, they specialized in importing jukeboxes and slot machines to American military bases. It was, one might say, their first experience in the business of taking people's money in exchange for fleeting entertainment. Little did they know this would become something of a recurring theme. By the 1970s, Sega had transformed itself into an arcade pioneer, creating coin-operated marvels that would make children beg their parents for quarters with the persistence of tiny, sugar-fueled lobbyists. Earlier hits like Periscope and Missile had established their reputation, though they also gave us curiosities like Pongtron and Fonz, because apparently someone at Sega looked at the Fonzie character and thought, yes, this leather-jacketed teenager is exactly what our arcade game needs.
Run.
But it was in the 1980s that Sega truly began to display the combination of brilliance and bewildering decision-making that would define their legacy. They launched the Master System in 1986, a console that was, by all technical measures, superior to Nintendo's NES. Better graphics, better sound, better everything. In America, it sold about as well as umbrellas in the Sahara, though it found considerable success in Europe and Brazil, where it actually dominated the market for years. Nintendo, you see, had locked down the American market with the iron grip of a medieval guild. They controlled which games could be made, when they could be released, and presumably what developers were allowed to eat for breakfast. Sega's superior technology met Nintendo's superior business practices, and technology, as it often does, politely lost. Undeterred by this mixed reception, crushing American defeat but genuine European success, Sega regrouped. In 1989, they launched the Genesis, accompanied by a marketing campaign so aggressively confident it bordered on the therapeutic. Genesis does what Nintendo doesn't, they proclaimed. And this time, they were right. The Genesis became a genuine commercial success, particularly in North America and Europe. But then, in 1991, something miraculous happened. Sega created a blue hedgehog with an attitude problem and running shoes. Sonic the Hedgehog was everything Mario wasn't. Fast, edgy, and possessing what marketers would later describe as radical coolness. It was as if someone had asked, what if we took Nintendo's wholesome plumber and gave him a mohawk and a motorcycle? Sonic worked. Suddenly Sega had a mascot that could compete with the mustachioed Italian who had been stomping on mushrooms since the Carter administration. The Genesis began selling, and for a brief, shining moment, Sega found itself in the unprecedented position of actually making money selling video game consoles. The early 1990s became known as the Console Wars, though unlike most wars, this one was fought primarily through television advertisements and playground arguments. Sega's marketing department, apparently staffed by caffeinated teenagers, launched campaigns that would make modern social media managers weep with envy. They told children that Genesis was cool, while Nintendo was for babies. They featured teenagers shouting Sega, with the enthusiasm typically reserved for religious revivals. It was brilliant, it was effective, it was also the high-water mark of Sega's success, though they wouldn't realize this for several years. By 1994, Sega had achieved about 55% of the American 16-bit console market. They had given Nintendo a genuine fight, though globally, the Super Nintendo still outsold the Genesis. Still, in America at least, they were winning. Naturally, this was the perfect time to make a series of decisions so catastrophically poor that business schools would later study them as cautionary tales. First, there was the 32X, released in 1994. This was an add-on for the Genesis that promised to extend its life by adding 32-bit capabilities. It was essentially a console sitting on top of another console, like some sort of technological bunk bed. The 32X sold over 1 million units worldwide, which sounds respectable until you realize it was meant to be a major platform extension, not a niche curiosity. But the 32X was merely the opening act. The main event was the Sega Saturn, which had actually launched successfully in Japan in November 1994. But in America, Sega decided to surprise everyone, including game developers, retailers, and apparently their own marketing department, by launching it 4 months early in May 1995, rather than the planned September date. This surprise launch had all the strategic brilliance of a surprise birthday party where you forget to invite the birthday person. Most games weren't ready. Most stores didn't have inventory. Most customers had no idea it existed. Sony, meanwhile, was preparing to launch their PlayStation in September at $299. Sega had priced the Saturn at $399, which in $1995 was roughly equivalent to selling your firstborn child. The Saturn's early launch is often cited as one of the greatest marketing disasters in video game history, which is saying something in an industry that once convinced people to buy a console shaped like a wedge of cheese. It alienated retailers, confused consumers, and gave Sony a 4-month head start to perfect their launch strategy. Sony's response was elegant in its simplicity. At the first Electronic Entertainment Expo, after Sega had finished their Saturn presentation, Sony executive Steve Race took the stage and said one word: $299. It was the corporate equivalent of a mic drop. The Saturn was dead before it had truly lived. But Sega, displaying the persistence of a particularly optimistic lemming, pressed on. They had learned from their mistakes. They would not repeat the Saturn's errors. They would create a console so magnificent, so technically superior, so utterly brilliant that consumers would have no choice but to embrace it. They created the Dreamcast. The Dreamcast, launched in 1999, was everything the Saturn wasn't. It was affordable, launching at $199. It was innovative, featuring built-in internet connectivity when most people still thought the World Wide Web was something spiders made. It had genuinely brilliant games: Shenmue, Jet Set Radio, Crazy Taxi, titles that were so creative they seemed to come from an alternate dimension where video game executives took LSD for breakfast. The Dreamcast was, by any reasonable measure, ahead of its time. It was the Tesla of video game consoles, brilliant, innovative, and doomed by forces beyond its control. The problem was that Sony was preparing to launch the PlayStation 2, which would play DVDs. This was 1999, when DVD players cost $300 and the PS2 would cost $299. Sony was essentially giving away a gaming console with every DVD player purchase. It was a strategy so obvious, so brilliant, that one wonders why no one at Sega thought of it. Well, actually, they did consider it. But they opted for their proprietary GD-ROM format to keep costs down and meet their timeline. It was a reasonable business decision that happened to be catastrophically wrong in hindsight. The Dreamcast sold about 9.1 million units worldwide, but Sega had already lost the confidence of retailers and consumers. They had cried wolf too many times. The 32X, the Saturn's American debacle, the constant promises of "this time will be different." It was like watching someone repeatedly touch a hot stove and express surprise at the burning sensation. In 2001, Sega announced they were discontinuing the Dreamcast and exiting the console hardware business entirely. It was a decision that sent shockwaves through the gaming industry, primarily because most people were shocked that Sega had lasted as long as they had. And so, Sega transformed from a hardware manufacturer into a software company, creating games for the very competitors they had once mocked. Sonic, who had spent the 1990s telling children that Genesis does what Nintendo doesn't, was now appearing on Nintendo consoles. It was the corporate equivalent of joining the enemy after burning down your own castle. But here's the remarkable thing about Sega's transformation. They were rather good at it. Freed from the burden of creating hardware, they could focus on what they had always done well, making genuinely innovative games. Series like Yakuza and Total War showcased their creative strengths, while strategic acquisitions like Atlas in 2013 brought beloved franchises like Persona under their banner. Today, Sega continues to make games, though they do so with the quiet dignity of a former emperor who now runs a successful bakery. They've found their place in the ecosystem, creating software for consoles made by companies that learned from Sega's mistakes. The story of Sega is, ultimately, a story about the relationship between innovation and execution. They were, consistently, about 5 years ahead of their time and 6 months behind their deadlines. They created the future and then watched other companies profit from it. So here's a question for you. What's your favorite Sega game or console? Was it the Genesis that introduced you to Sonic's world? The underappreciated Saturn with its cult classics? The brilliant doomed Dreamcast? Or perhaps one of their modern software releases that proves they never lost their creative spark? Let us know in the comments below.